Hi, I'm Tom Payton, Director and Publisher of Trinity University Press. As a nonprofit, community-focused educational publisher, we're committed to an evolving agenda of work that engages, questions, and brings us together as a community in effective and productive ways. When I first joined Trinity in 2010, we were planning an upcoming book that everyone was curious and excited about: Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril. It was clear to us that this was a book that was critically needed. The voices of more than 80 visionaries, theologians and religious leaders, scientists, elected officials, business leaders, naturists, activists, and writers put forth a diverse and compelling call to honor our individual and collective moral responsibilities to our planet. The focus on ethics and spirituality, as well as compassion and justice, laid a path for people to find common ground. And this perspective on climate and our Earth has grown expansively since. Of course, we're proud of all the books we publish, but certain ones stand out. They stand the test of time. They help shape public discussion. They change minds, and as they say, they move the needle. Moral Ground is a book that was and still is needed in discussion and action about climate. And we're so proud of our association with it, and happy to be celebrating it still now more than 10 years later. We extend our gratitude and admiration to the editors who envisioned and curated this book, Kathleen Dean Moore and Michael Paul Nelson, who are with us tonight, along with contributors Robin Morris Collin, John Perry, Carl Safina, and Terry Tempest Williams. What a lineup. Kathleen Dean Moore is Distinguished Professor Emerita at Oregon State University and a moral philosopher, activist, an award-winning author who writes about the moral urgency of climate action. Her most recent related books are Great Tide Rising, Toward Clarity and Moral Courage in a Time of Planetary Change, Earth's Wild Music, Celebrating and Defending the Songs of the Natural World, and the co-edited volume, Bearing Witness, The Human Rights Case Against Fracking and Climate Change. Michael Paul Nelson holds the Ruth H. Spaniel Chair of Renewable Resources and is Professor of Environmental Ethics and Philosophy at Oregon State University. He serves as the lead principal investigator at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest Ecological Research Program and is a senior fellow with the Spring Creek Project for Ideas, Nature, and the Written Word, as well as being philosopher in residence for the Isle Royale Wolf Moose Project. Kathleen and Michael will introduce the contributor guests with us. You can purchase the book Moral Ground using the link in the chat and receive a 20% discount on it and other books by our panelists using the promo code MG10. Thank you again, Kathleen and Michael, for all that you do. And thanks to all of you for joining us in this discussion.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you with us. We're honored to have you with us tonight and to welcome a truly mind-blowing set of guests, all here to mark the 10th anniversary of the publication of Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril. Kathy, should we start by telling the story of how the book came to be?
Yeah, sure, Michael. Hi. It was more than a decade ago, 12 years, that Michael and I gathered a group of 20 philosophy PhDs. Honestly, we needed their help because we were baffled. We hope that these people with really highly credentialed brains would have some answers. Why is the world so unable to make progress to slow climate change? What would it take to get us unstuck? The world knew what had to be done. Everybody knew the consequences of failure, but everybody seemed absolutely incapable of getting started. So we gathered these philosophers at the H.J. Andrews Research Forest. I have to tell you, that's an ancient forest in the Oregon Cascades. These towering hemlocks, these Douglas firs, some of them 500 years old. Shafts of light were beaming down on us through the branches onto the green moss. It was truly a holy place. And if there was any place that would remind us of our inescapable obligations to the deep past of the planet and to the future, that was it. So, with high hopes, we gathered in a circle. And you know what? Those philosophers started to dink around. The forest appears to be green, But is it green, or is it only our perception of green? Damn it, we were aghast. There is no time for that. Michael and I took ourselves off into a corner that evening, and we really pushed ourselves. Okay, we're philosophers, we confess it. What do we know how to do? What does the world need? And how might we step up to help fill that need? It seemed that the one skill that we could bring to the table was moral reasoning. We knew how to use facts and moral convictions to reach conclusions about what should be done. Maybe we could put that skill to use.
Our colleagues in climate science were telling us these terrifying stories about the reality of climate change. It's real, it's dangerous, and it's here. The world was not responding to that sense of urgency that they were trying to portray. So they redoubled their efforts to inform us. They thought that if people only knew, if they only knew, they would act. But we realized that that's a logical error. What logical error? Well, take this example. By modeling empirical evidence, scientists predict, for example, that if the world doesn't change course, an estimated 83 million people will die from the effects of climate change by the end of the century. Does that tell us that we have to change course? It does not by itself. A person could respond, well, that's too bad. I guess that's the price you have to pay to continue an industry that earns 2.1 trillion a year while it keeps the lights on and the economy growing. So then we would conclude that we continue on our current path. Or a person could respond, that is moral outrage. That is a violation of the right to life of 83 million people. That is a cosmic crime. If so, then we would conclude that we have to change course. So what's needed to arrive at an action-oriented conclusion is a moral affirmation, a statement of what is morally valuable, what is good and just, what is worthy of us as moral beings. So we decided that what was needed, what we could contribute, was a conversation about the values at stake in the climate crisis, a moral conversation that was as powerful as the conversation about the science.
Yeah. So what we did was we decided to write to 100 of the world's moral leaders. Desmond Tutu, the Dalai Lama, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, who is the former chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Winona LaDuke, Terry Tempest Williams, John Perry, Robin Morris Collin, Carl Safina. And we asked them to answer this question in 2,000 words or less. Do we have a moral obligation to take action to protect the future of a planet in peril? We got back the most beautiful, powerful responses. They offered lots of different reasons. So we sorted the essays into the chapters by reason, and we put them in this book, Moral Ground. It moved us, didn't it, Michael, that the chapter heads in the table of contents read like a poem or a prayer or a promise. Do we have a moral obligation to protect a planet in peril?
Yes, for the survival of humankind.
Yes, because compassion requires it.
Yes, because justice demands it.
Yes, because the world is beautiful.
Yes, to honor our duties of gratitude.
Yes, for the stewardship of God's creation.
Yes, to keep our promises to the children.
Yes, to honor our duties to future generations.
Yes, because our moral integrity requires us to do what is right.
Yes, because we love the world.
Since the book was published, we've seen a surge in moral arguments that became a flood this year, really, when the streets and the courts filled with people making arguments about justice and human rights. When the activists on the streets in Glasgow shout, keep it in the ground, it's as much a moral obligation as it is about parts per million. Activists are not shouting climate change is impractical, they're shouting shame.
Yeah, you're right. And here we have Greta Thunberg, who is speaking in ferocious moral terms. You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But I don't want to believe that, because if you did understand the situation and still kept on failing to act, I would have to call you evil. So maybe inside the COP26 halls, the conversation is still about dollars and parts per million. But in the streets, from the conscience of the street, comes this great confluence of moral voices of young people, right? And future generations speaking, it's people speaking for future generations, indigenous people, people of color, religious leaders, and moral thought leaders like the people who are gathered here, all of them coming together to say that climate change is an issue of racial and social and intergenerational justice. Naomi Klein wrote this. She said, "There is nothing more powerful than a rights-based argument. We're not going to win this as bean counters. We're going to win this because this is an issue of values, human rights, right and wrong." Nothing gives me more hope. So let's go ahead then, Michael, okay? And let's welcome the first of our moral thought leaders. Let's welcome Carl Safina. Carl is an endowed professor of humans and nature at the Stony Brook University. Hi, Carl.
Hi.
He's the founding president of the Safina Center. Of all his wonderful books, my favorites are Becoming Wild, How Animal Cultures Raise Family, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace. But the real book of his that has a place in my heart is the immortal, the beautiful Song for the Blue Ocean. For Moral Ground, Carl wrote an essay he called The Moral Climate. Carl, I bet I have quoted that 100 times, really.
Wow.
We're sacrificing animals. Remember this? We're sacrificing animals, peace, and children to retain wastefulness while enriching those who disdain us. Those words practically spit off the page. So Carl, tell us, what were you saying in that essay that you wrote 10 years ago?
Well, that came, I think, partly out of a question I was asked at a small conference of supposedly thought-leading people in Aspen. And I was, I was somehow talking about the threats that we face with these, what I call the three catastrophes: the extinction crisis, the toxicity crisis, and the climate crisis. And a person asked me in a challenging way, what would you be willing to sacrifice to make the world the way that you would want it? And I simply, I guess that enraged me. I may have responded badly because I don't really remember my response, but someone who was there remembers it and reminds me of it a lot. What I said to him was, how can you talk about sacrifice in the face of giving up the entire living world? I mean, we're killing the world, and you want to know what I would sacrifice, instead of understanding that sacrificing the world to basically your greed and things you like to have is any kind of a trade-off or anything that we could even compare. I mean, it's not even a discussion, really. That was kind of bad, but a few years later, I had a very, very brief little interchange with somebody after I gave a talk. I was a speaker on a cruise ship, and we were in the Antarctic.
Nice.
One of the morally compromised privileges that a person like me gets. Do you go to a place like that on a ship like that to talk to people? Is this a good thing to do? I think it is a good enough thing to do. But anyway, I was talking about a lot of these problems that we talk about all the time. Somebody asked me, how many people did I think the world should be able to support reasonably? Because I always highlight the fact that underpinning all of these problems is the fact that there are simply so many people, and the world human population has tripled in my lifetime. That means 3 times as many people, tripled. I find that breathtaking. So I said, I think that as far as I can more or less tell about the number of people that were around in 1800, there were plenty of people around in 1800. In fact, they were sort of overrunning the place already. And there were about 1 billion people. So I said, in my response to that question, I think maybe 1 billion people. Well, after my talk, one of these people on the ship came over to me, not very hostile, a little testy, And he shook his very expensive digital camera at me and said, if there were 1 billion people, you wouldn't have one of these. I mean, just nuts. First of all, if there were 1 billion people 200 years into the Industrial Revolution, we would all have nice cameras if we could afford them anyway. But the idea that you could let the world decay so you can have a digital camera and take pictures of penguins was, I just thought, really emblematic. There were a few people there who seemed to be moved by what I was saying. Obviously, I didn't really quite get through to him. So, we spend trillions on wars and on the fossil fuels that make a lot of the problems that we're talking about, as far as the climate destabilization anyway. And also a lot of the toxics come from fossil fuels that are used in various products in agriculture and all our plastics. All of that is basically petroleum, or a lot of it is anyway. Why do we say that it's too expensive to make the world a place that our children can depend on and that all the other species can exist in? Why is that too expensive? Well, this is a moral problem. It's a moral issue. You asserted earlier that these things are moral. Fixing the problems is a moral imperative, but that only is true if it flows from the values that you have and the values that you've been given. There are a lot of people who have been given very different values. I am currently working on a book in which I try to understand where all of this comes from. And for one thing, if you think about where most of our values come from and are taught, they basically come from ancient philosophies, from the economic system, and from religions. And all of those things were set in their current form, including the capitalist system that we mainly use, by around somewhere between 2,000 years ago and around 12 or 1300. That's when capitalism basically developed its entire philosophy. Well, nobody at that time really understood that the world was even round. Absolutely nobody knew that the world changes, and no one ever thought that anything people could do could possibly harm the world. Science happened around the early 1800s, where people started to realize through the first geology that the world used to look very different. The first astronomy told us the universe is, wow, it's big, and that implies deep time. Biology started to understand that things have evolved. They haven't always looked the way that they have. And science is the only thing, compared to all those things I mentioned, the only thing that says, as we understand more, we will believe differently. But what science does not do is apply value judgments and morals to things. It only finds stuff out. So there's a huge disconnect between what we value, what we're taught to value, and what we have found out. Why do we not respond to what we have found out? Why don't we think this is a big problem? And I say we, meaning, the people who are not making the right decisions, the so-called leaders, and the banks and the big religious institutions. Why are they not screaming to apply the brakes and reverse course? Well, I'm actually writing a book that delves into exactly that question. And I've looked at basically value systems that were developed over the last few thousand years around the big regions of the world. And they seem to fall, to me, they seem to fall into about 4 categories. One is the indigenous peoples of the world, who have a lot in common in how they have viewed their place in nature. The other is South Asian people, East Asian people, and Westerners. The Western view has overtaken the world, and the Western economic system has overtaken the world, but the Western values are a strange outlier among all the world's ways of perceiving the human place in the world and the cosmos. Starting with Plato, he said the world is a flawed place, that we should not value the earth, that perfection lies elsewhere in a different plane off this planet, and that the earth is a profane thing, subject to decay.
So I have to ask you, given all this, and I'm sorry to cut you off because I think that's an absolutely, that sounds like a wonderful philosophical endeavor. But the last sentence of your essay back 10 years ago was this. You said, we need to create the needed resolve. I know we can, and I think we will. Would you say that today?
Well, I certainly know we can. I think we will, but the time to avoid most of the big problems we have had passed a long while ago. And what I observed quite a while ago, maybe 30 years ago, when I first started working on some environmental activism, is that people argue about important issues until the situation becomes inarguably bad. And then they do what's needed. I think the situation is now becoming inarguably bad. And I think that that's why we're seeing the relatively massive uprising that we are seeing relative to 10 years ago. Probably 10 years from now, it will intensify to the point where change will be forced. By that time, there will be a lot of momentum that does not quite exist yet toward the changes that we need, I think.
Well, let us hope and pray. And let's bring on Robin Morris Collin, who has some, I'm sure, comments to make about that. Thank you.
Robin, let me introduce Robin. She's our second guest. Robin is the Norma Paulus Professor of Law at Willamette University College of Law in Oregon. She's the first U.S. law professor to teach sustainability courses in a U.S. law school, and is the co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Sustainability. For Moral Ground, she wrote an essay called Restoration and Redemption. Both Robin and her essay are incredibly wise and powerful and deeply perceptive. So Robin, welcome. Can you remind us of the argument that you made in your essay 10 years ago?
Yes. And I would say to Carl and all gathered, it's so good to see you. I am really happy and honored to be in your presence. And with that, welcome to my world. I am a Black person. And that means for me, my people in Africa and in the United States, wherever we are in the diaspora, have been suffering unequally for a very long time. We have been dying unequally for a very long time. Especially as a woman and a Black person, my intersectionality puts me at the very, very bottom of the human heap. And that means that we have been suffering for a very long time. Do I wish that on anyone? Absolutely not. Nobody should live that way. No being should live that way. It's disrespectful. Having said all that, I want to share with you, our response has been activism. And even though we come from a position of lowest on the totem pole, so to speak, my community, people who have been deprived of health, of education, of housing, of all these other things. This year, with all of these trillions of dollars that we're talking about, finally, we are talking about environmental justice. Finally, we are talking about the fate of the most imperiled, the most precarious of us. And I think there is something hopeful in that. I want to send the message. What I tried to say in 2010 was, we are connected. We cannot be indifferent to one another. We cannot afford to be indifferent. And what has borne truth are viruses, real and virtual. All of the massive suffering that is climate change that we now see, but it's visited unequally on people. We see all of that. My message was to try to persuade our readers that this comes back to a set of values. And I wanted to persuade people to identify those values and to go after them. And by putting a spotlight on certain toxic values. My hope was to stimulate activism. So just to give them their proper names, those values that I was pointing at lead to delusions. And I said this in my essay. And it is delusions that have brought us into illness. When we look at, you're pointing at madness, you're pointing at insanity. Who on earth would do this to themselves except that we're doing this to ourselves? That's delusional, that's insanity. How do you explain that? Well, I said they are the product of a set of toxic values. Number one, Carl has already said it, greed. Greed used to be a sin. It is a sin. It's a sin against us. It's a sin against our world. Why have we allowed greed to govern? Because greed has created a mythology around itself. That was another point I tried to put into my essay, that mythology around itself. It's self-rationalizing. It puts a fig leaf over all the ugly stuff it does. Greed is at the bottom of this rapaciousness, this insatiability, this eating of ourselves, of our species, eating our own children in a way. It's just insanity, but there is a reason for it. Racism is another idea, this idea of race. This is delusional. It is a product of a deliberate system of exploitation. There are a couple of others that I point out, but they're all ideas, toxic values. What do we do about that? And what I would say today, 10 years later, yes, I look at the anger and I see the incredible sadness and grief. I see this sense of victimhood and hatred, and it's worse than I ever imagined I would see. At least I never thought I would see it at this scale and this publicly. What do I say to that? I say we need to organize. I want to quote Mother Jones. Don't grieve, organize, mobilize. And especially to young people. I understand your anger. I said in my 2010 essay, I understand that. I'd be angry too, but wait. Anger is not the answer to evil. And I believe evil is very real and occasionally swamps us. We might be in that moment now. But for people who are looking forward, anger is not the response to evil. You have to strategize. What do I mean by strategy? I mean, we have to point at those toxic values and those toxic people and pin them in a way. I don't mean the physical violence, but I mean leverage them. So for wealth, how can we challenge wealth and greed? We did that with South African investment and disinvestment. We can do that. That South African disinvestment movement was led by students who thought they could do anything. They weren't wealthy. We're all various stages of academia. We can all ignore students, right? No, we didn't. We won that one. And you know what was great about that? Was because not a shot was fired over that. That was a peaceful transition of power to Nelson Mandela. Who would have thought? I never thought that in my lifetime that would ever happen. So I want to just say to you, 2010 and 2021, I am in no way tired, and I am in no way ready to call this quits. Absolutely not. What I want to say to people is be practical, be skeptical, get busy. Pick up the blanket, whatever corner is nearest to you, because it's all interconnected. You lift up that blanket and you'll find it's all the same blanket. So I do a lot of work with environmental justice. I do a lot of work with women. I do a lot of work in terms of sustainability. I do a lot of work with electrical vehicle collaboration here in Oregon. All of it's the same blanket. Pick up the piece that works for you and do not allow these toxic values to be internalized by you or anybody around you. Call them out. You see them, call them out. That's the way to start. Thank you so much for letting me come back and preach a little bit. It is so wonderful to be in your presence.
Bless you, Robin. Thank you so much.
Yes, bless you for you are truly a truth teller. Let's invite now John Perry. And John is the Henry Walgrave Stewart, Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Stanford University. He's the co-host of the nationally syndicated radio show Philosophy Talk. If you haven't heard that, you should tune in. It's marvelous. I like John. I really like John. He is whip smart and he is funny. And so it won't surprise you when I tell you that his new book is called The Art of Procrastination, a guide to effective dawdling, lollygagging, and postponing, which makes me glad he is with us today. And I think he'll have something to say about to whom those words are directed. For Moral Ground, he wrote the essay that's called Worship the Earth. It ends in perfect John Perry style. You never know. John, talk to us. Tell us what you're thinking. What were you thinking 10 years ago? And what are you thinking now?
Well, thank you very much. First, let me say how great it is to be with this group of people. And I always had high opinion of Oregon State University, particularly after my student Bill Ugalis went there, who was wonderful. But then 10 years ago, I discovered that there's this whole group of ecologically minded people at Oregon State. What a wonderful place it is. Oregon's a good state, but Oregon State is what a gift to the nation. And that, quite aside from the fact that they occasionally beat Stanford. 10-year, well, let me start quite a while back. When I was about 10 or 12 years old, my neighbor, who was very much Christian, and took me to the Back to the Bible thing in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I heard a very effective speaker, and in the end, I went forward and I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal savior. And then in a couple of weeks, I got a bunch of readings from the Back to the Bible people, which I read. They were mostly from the New Testament, very inspiring. But like a nerd, I got interested in the Bible and I started to read the Old Testament. My God, that is the most disgusting thing you can read. All the things that God did, turning people into salt because they wanted to look back as their home was being destroyed. So for the next 50 years or so, well, until the present actually, I wrestled. I mean, as I studied religion, I realized, well, it's really responsible for a lot of good. Things that we worship tend, education, Catholic colleges, so forth and so on. On the other hand, it's all bullshit. So what do you do with this phenomenon? So 10 years ago, although I was officially hired to think about things of great importance, like proper names and indexicals like I and this, I still spent a lot of my time thinking about religion. And then it occurred to me that, well, religion's got one thing going for it. The idea of worship. If you worship something, and if the choice is good, that's an extremely good thing. You don't have to wait for Peter Singer to say it's okay, or for John Locke to say it's okay, or for John Stuart Mill to say it's okay, or for Kant to say it kind of follows from the transcendental unity of whatever. It's just kind of beyond that, right? If you worship something, then it has, and because I think some things are right, some things are wrong. I think it's good to have something that really gets people committed to things that I think are right. And religion can do that, although it can also do the opposite, get people committed to bullshit. I'm sorry. Forgive me, YouTube or whoever we're on. So 10 years ago, when you asked me to contribute to Moral Ground, that was my main thought. Look, religion has a lot not going for it from the point of view of a philosopher. On the other hand, it has something going for it, this concept of worship, this concept of getting people to kind of not sit around and see what John Stuart Mill has to say about it, but to just fully commit to something's being right or something being wrong. And I thought that worship was worthy of analysis. So I thought, well, there's two things that something you worship ought to have. It ought to be responsible for the things about existence that you like. But, and, so that, that would be true of God, or, the prime numbers, which Russell worshipped, but the second thing is worshiping it ought to do it some good. Why do I believe that? Well, I don't know, just kind of a transcendental illumination of light. But anyway, I believe it. Now, God, as in the Old Testament, kind of a queer old duck, he, if we worship him and we do the things he wants us to, but that's not the God that developed in the Catholic and Anglican religions, the two religions in my childhood. It was this completely omnipotent, everything being that we couldn't understand at all. Well, what's the point of worshiping someone that you can't understand what he would want you to do? So in the essay I wrote for you, I come to the conclusion the one thing that qualifies with these two things that something ought to have for us to worship it. It ought to be responsible for the things we like about things, and it ought to be something that benefits from our worship. The only thing I could think of is the earth. We ought to worship the earth because the earth is responsible. Maybe it's not the original thing. Maybe that's God or the prime numbers or who knows what. But somewhere along the line, the earth played an extremely important part in everything that we value and like, from carrots to philosophy, to draw a subtle distinction. And so we ought to worship the earth. So that was my view 10 years ago. Now, 10 years later, my view hasn't changed, but my emotions have. I wasn't angry enough. 10 years ago, it had been 10 years since we had passed up the chance to have Al Gore as being leader of the free world, which would really have made a difference. 10 years ago, we were already involved in a couple of stupid wars, but I wasn't angry enough. But now, one of our authors, not the Carl that's here, who wrote a very interesting essay, but another Carl said that what we need for the next, we need to get morality on steroids. When I look back at my essay, I wasn't angry enough. And that's what we need to do. Philosophy is fine, reason is fine. But when you look at the history of civil rights and things like that, there's a lot to be said for anger, righteous anger. I'm not in favor of unrighteous anger, but I'm in favor of righteous anger. For the next 10 years, I'm going to be angry. I'll probably continue to write about proper names and stuff like that, but I'm going to write some essays that are really mad at people that are just screwing around with the environment. I mean, Elon Musk, it's very good that can now spend a lot of money for a car that runs on electricity. But is it, spending zillions of dollars to send people into space, so forth and so on. So I think what the intellectual crowd, which I don't exactly lead, but I'm a part of, we need to get angry. We need, ecology needs to be like civil rights has been in its best years. Something that gets people out on the streets, something that makes people angry, something that you don't let just pass. You really criticize people that are doing stupid things that hurt the environment. So that's my resolution for the next 10 years. I will continue with my worm farm. Which if everybody would just do like I do and take all your scraps and not put them in the garbage disposal, but put them in the backyard in some kind of container that you put some worms into, that would be a good thing. I'm going to do that. That's the thing I'm most confident would be a good thing to do. But in addition, I'm going to try to use whatever literary talents I have to strike out at all the idiots that are are in favor of bad environmental practices or not suitably in favor of good environmental practices. It just ought to be like if someone was getting on Facebook or YouTube or CNN and advocating child molestation. It's every bit as bad. It shouldn't be allowed. We should be angry. Those of us that have minds should use them in that way. So that's what I'm going to do. Maybe move to Oregon, although I guess it's kind of not what it used to be in terms of climate. But okay, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, John, you go, John. But one of the things that we really enjoyed about getting all the responses, and we really gratified when all these essays came in for a moral ground, was the variety of arguments that were given. And our goal wasn't to find the best one, or our goal wasn't to say, this is the one you should believe. Our goal was to say, here are an array of arguments. Find one that suits you. Find one that motivates you. And so I think what you're seeing tonight is the variety of kind of arguments that can be made. So now, Michael, will you introduce Terry?
I will. Our final guest at our party is Terry Tempest Williams. Terry is a writer, educator, conservationist, and activist. She's currently writer in residence at Harvard Divinity School and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She's the author of so many amazing and important books. Her writing has been personally impactful for me now for decades, really. Her most recent book of essays is entitled Erosion, Essays of Undoing. For Moral Ground, she wrote an essay called Climate Change, What is Required of Us? So welcome, Terry, and can you share the argument you made in that essay 10 years ago, 12 years ago?
Thank you, Michael. And Kathy, thank you for bringing us all together again in the name of community, in the name of the climate of now. And I'm so mindful of those who have joined us and so many dear friends and writers whom I count on and rely on. And it's an honor to be here with you, Robin and Carl and John. When I look back on these 10 years and thinking about what is required of us, for me personally, what is required is to pay attention, to bear witness, to listen more and talk less. I'm very mindful in these 10 years of the power of intersectionality that Robin was talking about, that the idea of a single issue, growing up and through these years, my single issue has been public lands. And I feel like now, racial justice, social justice, environmental justice are all one. And the climate is bringing us together, even though marginalized communities are going to suffer most and have, as you said, Robin. I find that my teachers now are the young people, and that in so many ways, I feel like my role is to step to the side and create an atmosphere where they feel safe to talk about what is on their mind and to have these intergenerational conversations. I'm mindful of two amazing young women that I've been in conversation with, Morgan Curtis, who was a student of mine at Dartmouth, and she's now at the Divinity School. She comes from a family of extreme wealth. She knew that, but she didn't know how much until after being at COP21 in Paris and being part of the UN youth leadership. They disrupted, they were disappointed, and she decided, I just have to look in the mirror and say, how am I going to change? What she decided was that she would make a vow, and 100% of her inherited wealth is now going to support Indigenous and Black-led land movements in the name of climate. To me, that's what is inspiring, these kinds of actions born out of such a deep commitment to change. I think about Bronte Velez, who is African-American, in her words, a queer liberationist. What she's doing in her environmental education and organizations, they are going to communities like Oakland or Atlanta, where they are from, and there is a retort in the middle of the communities, in the middle of the town square. They've invited mothers, Black, white, brown, who have lost children to gun violence, to bring forth those guns that killed, murdered their children. They place them in this retort of high temperature. It comes out molten, and then it flows into, rather than a mold of guns, a mold of shovels, to then together plant trees, not with a memory of lynching, but a memory of a different kind of future and genealogy. To me, that is what I'm listening to and what is inspiring to me. Also, where I live, I'm living on the ancestral and traditional lands of Ute people. Because of the issue of Bears Ears National Monument, the last 10 years have really been spent as an ally to the Dene, to the Hopi, to Zuni, to the Ute nations. And as a white environmentalist, it has been deeply humbling to follow rather than lead, and so important. And to be able to work with organizations like the Women of Bears Ears and to listen to what matters to them, the rematriation of the earth, to talk about redistricting in our own counties adjacent to Indian country and how we can support one another in those conversations. That's where my heart has been. So when I think about what is required of us, I think it is about listening. I think it is, for me, about being local in the sense of looking at the oil and gas leases and saying, what might we do, inspired by young people like Tim DeChristopher, to try and purchase leases legally, even if it costs you your job. So I just feel like we're in this climate of uncertainty. What we thought was a pause is now a place. And my prayers and actions are that this is a place of transformation that includes anger, call it sacred rage, that includes grief, that includes educating ourselves and re-educating ourselves as older people, and finding that this is not just an ecological process or a political process, but a spiritual one.
Thank you, Terry. That was wonderful. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're all together here. Finally, we've all arrived at the party, and we have one more task. We're going to dig in a little bit. The COP26 talks are ending with a lot of promises which are very likely to be broken. The young people are disgusted, and at the same time, the world is full of fall leaves and kestrels and little kids. So there's much to be saved. So a question, and we can just go around in the order that we arrived, is what should we do? What's one thing that we all can do right now? What's the most important thing, or a most important thing? Carl?
Well, you can do what you can. I mean, it's different for different people. Some people can volunteer on the front line of some protest, and some people can decide what they're going to major in, and some people can decide what they're going to drive, who they're going to vote for, what they're going to eat tonight. Other people can pledge their entire inheritance. It's different for different people. But everybody can do something. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. One of the problems is a lot of people either do nothing or they do the wrong things. And Yeats wrote the best lack intention when, I'm sorry, let me try that again. The best lack conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Well, I think the best should be full of passionate intensity. I know we feel it, but a lot of us feel it, but we are a little too insulated. And there are some people who have gotten very, very angry in the last few years. I'm not even sure they understand what they're angry about. A lot of it is very perplexing to me, a little frightening to me. But I do think that everybody can do something, and we need to figure out what it is and get out of our comfort zone and do some of that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What about you, Robin?
Well, I want to address My answer to the younger people in the audience, specifically, I wrote my essay originally to young people, and I want to speak to them specifically. The fact that we cannot solve things simply does not mean that you should despair. Often simple answers are lies. I won't say always, but if somebody has a silver bullet to offer, I would say that be careful, because that is what snake oil looks like and what it sells like. But here's the other thing. There's a lot of uncertainty facing young people, uncertainty about your future, and all kinds of levels of uncertainty. I would counsel with you and say this. When you don't know what to do, you do know who you want to be. Be that person. Start with who you are, be that person, and insist on your right to be that person. Young people have moved this world. They have changed things. And poor people have changed things. People who had no political power have changed things. And if you don't know your history, you need to know. Go out and find it, because it's there. And so I want to urge you, don't despair, organize, mobilize. And by the way, about anger, just a word. Having been a woman all my life and having been Black all my life, I know what it's like to be called angry all my life. Yeah, and righteously angry, but it gets you only so far. Be strategic. Find a point to press where you can change the most. And that's where you should channel your anger and your truth telling. Thanks again for letting me be with you tonight.
Thank you, Robin. I want to be your student. I wonder if they'll let me into Willamette University. That's very, very heartening. John, can you give us some advice? What are we gonna do?
Well, Robin in her essay said a couple of things that I really like. So I'll start by quoting them. She says, "We are the only creatures that lie." Now, she may be wrong about that, because I'm not sure about cats. We invest our desires and impulses with reason, the fig leaf for desire. Reason as the fig leaf for desire. That really struck me when I first read her article. And, reason. Now, if you're a philosopher, you're devoted to reason. And that ought to take you aback. Is reason just a fig leaf for desire? Well, it's at least often a fig leaf for desire. So that's, like somebody just said, everybody should do what they can. They should focus on where they can change things. Well, philosophers need to focus on keeping reason from just being a fig leaf for desire. And there's so much, what's the appropriate polite word, crap going on in our culture. So many, and some of it has all this history of reason behind it, capitalism and communism and all that stuff. But we just need to say, whatever we desire, whatever we want, surely having the earth around for as long as possible is something we should all be able to agree on, or we should be able to ignore those who don't. So let's pull reason as the fig leaf of other desires off, but use reason to promote that thing that really everybody ought to value. You may be like me, you may be a philosopher that's got tenure by thinking about proper names and amnesia and things like that. But for crying out, you lose some of your time to criticize the idiots, well, not idiots, but the frauds out there that are using reason as an excuse for not doing what we obviously need to do about the environment. So, thank you.
Thank you. So Terry, what should we do? Or maybe Robin's question, who should we be? Or some combination.
I honestly, I'm left with more questions than answers. So I'm not sure I have any answers. I know the things that have mattered to me most. And first and foremost, building community, being part of a community, and communities that interlock with each other. To me, that's been the most important thing. Because I think in community, anything is possible and we are held to account. I also feel that to build resiliency with one another, to support one another, to stand in solidarity together, so that we can have the strength, find the strength to not look away from all that is breaking our hearts. I mean, I can tell you right now, Great Salt Lake is a horizon of salt. What at one time was a flood is now beyond drought. And recently I went out to Great Salt Lake and to the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge that has always been my sanctuary of hope. And there was no bird song. Those 77,000 acres of wetlands that sparkle and sing are not there. And what do you do with that? And so I think that our task as human beings is to bear witness and to try and tell the truth of what we see, even if it's hard to bear. And then when we see the meadowlarks, when we see, as I did this morning, ravens the color of silver and morning light, to celebrate the beauty that remains. And I think for me, it's the koan that Isa writes, insects on a bough floating down river, still singing. So I think, how do we hold these contradictory emotions at once? On one hand, the despair, the grief, on the other hand, the joy and the community, and bring these two hands together in prayer. Then I think we are on a path to being the kind of human beings we want to be together.
Thanks, Terry.
You
Kathy,
know,
what about you?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I agree with Terry. When people say to me, what can one person do? My answer always is, stop being one person. You can't do this yourself. You need to come together with other people and use your combined strength. Give each other courage. But when I think about this question about what are we going to do? What should we do? I'm quite aware that for a long, long time, the fossil fuel industry has been giving us a lot of advice about how individuals can help. Those pamphlets, 50 Ways to Save the Planet, many of them are written by the fossil fuel industry themselves. What do they tell us we have to do? Compost. Change out your light bulbs. All as individuals. Recycle. Buy an Energy Star clothes dryer. I get so mad. I mean, what they fail to mention is what should be number one, is stop fossil fuel mining in its oily, bloody tracks. That's how to save the planet. What the fossil fuel industry is doing is on track to become the greatest violation of human rights and nature's rights that the world has ever seen. And governments, oh, Jesus, you all remember, right? That to ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Well, where did that go? Governments are not only failing to stop these violations, they're in collusion with the worst of them. Subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, tax and enforced regulations, corruption, pure and simple, police powers. It's an axis of betrayal. And now they're making protest a felony. And they're bringing out their big guns. They're bringing out the rubber bullets and the tanks and the deafening loudspeakers and the razor wire. And who is paying those police? The fossil fuel industry themselves. And governments are making sure then that the corporations' violations of human rights have escalated into the violations of political rights, the rights to free speech and the rights to peacefully assemble. So I think we're in extraordinarily dangerous and that kind of double wrong. the collusion between government and the fossil fuel industry is what Arthur Schopenhauer would call treachery. And we're in a terribly dangerous situation. And I think that against that failure of governments to protect our rights and the massive violation of rights by the fossil fuel industry, the answer is going to come from the raucous, enraged, engaged conscience of the streets. And I think that's what we have to find. Michael, sing us out of here.
Well, I don't want to sound trite or anything, but I would just say, don't give up. I mean, we have to believe that we were made for these times, that, you know, we're exactly the right people to do this work. And one way to not give up, I think, is to not think of yourself as a stone tower buttressed against a storm, but as a plant, as forsythia. And I'm going to read a passage from Jared Anderson. He writes, as forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rocks. If your worldview is forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It is not an age for towers. It is an age for stubborn flowers. Kathy, you want to do the last thank yous?
Thank you. I love you all. I admire you all so greatly. And you give me courage and you give me some measure of hope. There is wisdom out there. And when we bring our voices together, I think we will, even if it takes a long time and even if it has to get really, really terrible, I think we will find what it means to stand up for justice. So thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you, all of the panelists. You are our dear friends and our heroes. Bless you all. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you so much. Such an honor to be among you all.